Good morning. We want to begin today's daf, Sanhedrin, daf Nun Daled. We begin by thanking all of our sponsors. We thank the annual Talmud Torah sponsor for the year of 5785, the Tilsa Mishpacha of Eretz Yisrael, the Schos from Surah's Terrace full of Am Yisrael. We also thank Dave Learning, which is sponsored by Aliyah Roseborough in honor of his upcoming marriage to Miriam Ruth Benmore today. Mazel Tov Aliyah. She was zeichet to be born by Yisrael B'Yisrael. She was zeichet to a tremendous amount of nachas. The house should be filled with bracha, hatzlacha, simcha, and kol tov. We also thank our week of learning sponsors. We thank Beryl and Rachel Galkin for sponsoring the shiurim of this week in honor of Beryl's grandfather's yahrzeit, whose Beryl's grandfather was Beryl ben Chaim Zechron Levracha, whose yahrzeit is today Yud Aleph Shvat, and Shema should have an aliyah, and the family should have a nechama. Today's daf is daf Nun Daled. We are going to pick up literally the first word on daf Nun Daled Amud Aleph in Masechah Sanhedrin. Yesterday we were discussing a machlokus that took place in the Mishnah. There's a machlokus in the Mishnah between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. What the halacha is, if a person is boel his mother, is he chayiv once because it's his mother, or twice because it's his mother and also his father's wife? So in the Mishnah, just quickly to recap the Mishnah tells us, this is on Daf Nun Gimel Amud Aleph, it says, a person's chayiv once because she is his mother, mishom eishes av, also because this woman is his father's wife. Yehuda disagrees and he says, Yehuda Omer, eino chayiv ela mishom ha'em bilvad. He's only chayiv once because of his mother. We didn't really discuss this yesterday, but what's the difference how many he's chayiv for? He's going to be put to death, as we discussed yesterday. A person can only be put to death once. So again, today's Gemara is going to be a little more clear about this, but the chiyuv is going to be if there is a shogeg, if it was done by mistake, if there for some reason there was a lapse of knowledge about what is going on over here. In such a case, how many chatos will he have to get? Whether a person will be chayiv malchus twice is a good question for other cases, but in a case where it's a chayav, either a chayav krisas or it is something which comes with the carbon, the question will be how many carbonos a person has to bring. So now the Gemara was trying to find the source. Rabbi Yehuda told us he's only chayiv one. And that was the majority of yesterday's Amud. And at the end we had the opinion of Rava. At the end we had the opinion of Amar Rava. So again, to recap the last four lines of Daf Nun Gimel Beis, Rava told us that the way that Yehuda darshan in the pasuk was Ervas Avicha did not refer to, as you may have thought, that Ervas Avicha refers to the father's erva. When it said Ervas Avicha in the pasuk, you may have thought that was talking about a person having this relationship with his father. Rather, he understands that Ervas Avicha refers to his father's wife, and therefore Imcha he is going to be extra. If Imcha is going to be extra, that comes to be Memayit, that the person is only chayiv one. That's how we ended off the Gemara yesterday. Now the Gemara wants to bring a raya to Rava's way of understanding Rav Yehuda. The Gemara is going to bring a long brisa, and at the end of the brisa, we're going to see what the raya is. Tanya Kavasei the Rava. We learned a brisa like Rava. Ish, it says in the pasuk Ish. What is this referring to? Again, this is the pasuk. If you have the pasuk on the side, so it's good to look into these pasukim because there's a number of pasukim that talk about this. It says Ish, Asher Yishkav Es Eshes Aviv, Ervas Avav Gila, Mois Yumsu Shneim Dmeim Bam. So it says V'ish, and a man Sheyishkav Es Eshes Aviv, who will sleep with his father's wife. Ervas Avav Gila, he has revealed the nakedness of his father. Mos Yumsu Shneim Dmeim Bam. They both have the chiyuv of Misa. Now, if you remember yesterday, we also quoted the pasuk, which is this was the pasuk in Vayikra Perek Chaf. We also quoted a pasuk yesterday of Ervas Avicha ve'Ervas Imcha lo segale. So that says Ervas Avicha, which refers, simple translation, should mean the father's erva, ve'ervas imcha, and the mother's erva, lo segali imcha hi. So what he says again, imcha hi, the mother, lo segali ervasa. Now we're dashing the other pasuk. Now let's read it together. Ish, it says in the pasuk Ish, amen. What does Ish come to say? What does it come to exclude? Prat lekatan, when it says Ish, it always comes to exclude a child. Asher yishkav es eshes aviv, who will sleep with his father's wife. Mashma bein eshes aviv shihi imo. This clearly says it's his father's wife. So it's regardless of whether this woman in question is his mother or not, whether this woman is not his mother. So in other words, in any case, there's going to be this chiyuv. Now, how do you know? Imo she'eno eshes aviv minayin. How do you know about a woman who is not? His mother, who is not his father's wife, Tamalomar, Ervas Aviv. The pasuk repeats itself at the end and says Ervas Aviv Gila. So again, reading the pasuk, what does it say? It says V'ish asher yishkav es eshes Aviv, a person who will sleep with the wife of his father. Why does it have to say Ervas Aviv Gila? What's the necessity to write? That's what the Gemara says. Tamalomar Ervas Aviv Gila, which are extra words. Mufna, that's now extra. Lahakish, to actually make this hekish, to create this juxtaposition. And what do we do once we have this? V'ladun mimenu gezerah shava. And therefore we can learn that there's a chiyuv for a mother who's not his father's wife. Okay, so what's the halacha? The pasuk tells us, Mos Yumsu. They're chayav misa. How are they punished with misa? Which misa is it? Biskila. The person is going to be put to death with skila, with stoning. Now, ata omer beskila oene elabachas v'komis semuris patara. Similar Gemara to what we saw yesterday. How do you know? Why are you assuming that because it says most yumas that they're going to be put to death with skila? Maybe it's going to be one of the other types of capital punishment. Gemara answers nemer kan d'meim bam. In this pasuk it ends off as we read before d'meim bam. V'nemer ba'ovi yadoni d'meim bam. It says by ovi yadoni we mentioned yesterday. It's clear. It says very clearly the person shall be stoned. So therefore we learn ma'ala alam beskila. Just like when it comes to Ovi Yadoni, a person who engages in some type of sorcery, as we discussed yesterday, in some type of communication with the dead, just like over there, it's Beskila, Afkam Beskila, we learn, in this case, the person is for engaging in such an activity is going to be punished with Skila. Now the Gemara says, all right, everything works out. We're still in the middle of the Brisa. Onesh Shamanu. We found the Onesh. We found the pasuk which tells us what the punishment is for engaging in this kind of behavior. Azhar minayin. Where do we have a warning for this? Now we have a klal that whenever there's a halacha or isser in the Torah and there's a punishment, you can't just have a pasuk that gives you the punishment. You have to have a verse, a pasuk which clearly writes that there's an isser, there's a prohibition to do it, and then if the person is going to violate that isser, then it's going to come with the punishments. Now we found the punishments, but we never found the azhar, the warning. So where does that come from? The Gemara says, Tamalomar, Ervas Avicha Lo Sigale. It says, Ervas Avicha Lo Sigale, the father's erva should not be revealed. Ervas Avicha Zu Eshes Avicha. So this is what we were talking about yesterday. We mentioned yesterday that it says in the pasuk, Ervas Avicha Lo Sigale, person should not reveal the erva of his father. Now, the simple translation of that word is, the father's erva, the father's actual erva. So this is a warning against having this relationship with one's father. Now the Gemara says, At Omer Eisha Savicha O Eino Ela Erva Savicha Mamish. How do you know if this is talking about the father's actual erva, or as the Brisa just told us, that it's referring to the father's wife? In other words, the father's erva can be referring to his own personal erva, or could be referring to the erva that he has access to, which is his wife. Which one does it mean? The Gemara says, Nemer Kan Ervas Avicha. It says here Ervas Avicha Lo Sigal. Should not be revealed. Ervas Aviv Gila. It says in the later pasuk, Ervas Aviv Gila. These are the two psukim that I mentioned at the beginning of the shir. You have those two psukim. One of them is in Vayikra Yud Ches, and one of them is in Vayikra Chaf. So two prakim apart from each other. And Ma'ala Alon B'Ishus Akas Medaber. Just like later on, it's clear that it's talking about his wife. Afkan Ishus Hakasav Medaber, over here as well, it must be talking about Ishus, and therefore it is not talking about a person engaging in this relationship with his father. Rather, it's talking about a person engaging in the relationship with his father's wife. Now the Gemara goes on, but in other words, that was the main point. The point that we just brought out was that when it says clearly in the pasuk Ervas Avicha, when it says Ervas Eishes Avicha Ervas avicha ve'ervas imcha lo segali. Ervas avicha was not referring to the father himself, rather it was referring to Ishas, and that's where you can have that azhara for. This fits perfectly with what Rabbi told us yesterday in the drasha for Rabbi Yehuda. Now the Gemara says, "Umashma bein eishes aviv shihi imai." You would think from that lashon that whether this woman who's married to his father is his mother, bein eishes aviv she'ena imai, whether this woman is not actually his mother but just his father's wife. Now, imo she'ena eishes aviv minayin. And where do we have an azhara, a warning for this person's mother who is not his father's wife? So again, they must have had this child out of wedlock. So therefore, there was znus that took place and the child was born. So again, the same way we asked earlier, that where do you have the punishment for it? Now the Gemara wants to know where are you going to have the azhara for it? Minayin tamalover, the pasuk tells us, ervas imcha lo segale. The erva of the mother should not be revealed. Ainli ella bazhara she'asa kasav. Now we know that. Now we have that azhara. Now she'asa kasav imo she'eno eishes aviv ki imo shehi ke'eshes shehi eishes aviv onish minayin. How are you going to know that the punishment is going to be the same? Never kan ervas avicha lo segaliv never alone ervas aviv gila. Now the Gemara explains ma ba'azhara, just like when it came to the azhara, asa hakasav imo. When it came to the warning, Asa Hakasav Imo She'ena Eishes Aviv, Ki Imo, the pasuk compared and equated a mother who was the father's wife, just like a regular mother, Ki Imo Shehi Eishes Aviv, just like a married mother to the father, Af Ba'onish, Asa Hakasav Imo. When it comes to this punishment as well, the pasuk makes the Imo, his mother, She'ena Eishes Aviv, who's not married to the father, Ki Imo Shehi Eishes Aviv, exactly the same as a mother who is married to the father. Now, the Gemara says imchahi. In other words, now you have this imcha, you have this extra word imcha, because again, if ervas aviv referred to the wife, so then imcha, the mother, is now going to be extra because it's the same thing. Now the Gemara says mishum imo atamechayvo v'atamechayvo mishum eishasav. This is ultimately the end of Rabbi Yehuda. This is Rabbi Yehuda comes for. In other words, since he uses ervas avicha to tell you that refers to the father's wife, so now imchahi is extra. If you have the imchahi being extra, now you have exeris akasa. Finally, after all this, to tell you Rabbi Yehuda is correct and saying that there's only one chiyuv if this person engages in this activity with this woman. So there's only going to be one chiyuv, not two chiyuvim, one for mother, one for father's wife. Rather, it's only going to be one. That is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. This is the Tanya, this is the Brisa that we're actually bringing to back up the way that Chachamim learned this, the way that Rava learned this on the previous summit. So it's a long Brisa, but ultimately to bring us back to the same exact conclusion, that Ervas Avicha tells us already that's referring to the wife. Imchahi is redundant, and therefore we have this Gzeres HaKasav, which is, Mishum Imai Ata Mechayvai, if a person engages in this relationship with his mother, who's also his father's wife, then he's going to be chayiv because of his mother, but not chayiv because of the father's wife. Okay, now, that was the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Yehuda told us there's only one chiyuv. However, the Chachamim now have a problem. The Gemara says, Rabbanan, Ervas Avicha, what are they going to do with the redundancy of Ervas Avicha and Imcha? Both of those seem to be saying the same thing. So why do they argue with Rabbi Yehuda and tell us that there's only one chiyuv? The Gemara tells us, according to the Rabbanan, they didn't learn the pasuk that way. And therefore, the Rabbanan, Ervas Avicha mamish. When the pasuk tells us very clearly, Ervas Avicha, Ervas Imcha lo segale, person should not reveal the erva of his father. You know what that meant? That meant literally a person should not sleep with his father. The Gemara says, hold on a second. There's another problem over there. Hi, mi ve'es zachar nafka. We know that there is a prohibition against a relationship between two men, and therefore his father is a man. He is a man. So therefore you already have a problem with this. Why do you have to have a pasuk telling you that a person should not reveal the erva of his father? The Gemara says, L'chayvai alav shtayim. You chayiv him twice. In other words, the Chacham have no problem. They mentioned already in the Mishnah he's chayiv twice. So now, why do you have a pasuk telling you not to reveal your father's erva? There are two specific isurim with a person engaging in a relationship with his father. One the typical chiyuv of ves zachal osishka mishkve isha. The second one is the chiyuv of a person having this intimate relationship with his father. Uked Rav Yehuda, not Rebbe Yehuda. It's very important because the Chachamim argue on Rebbe Yehuda. So it says Rav Yehuda here. It's a different person. Uked Rav Yehuda, the Amr of Yehuda, nachri haba al aviv. Rashi tells us, the Gemara tells us in about one line that this nachri over here is not referring to actual nachri, which is typically someone who's not Jewish. In this case, it's talking about a Jewish person. Why do we call him a Nachri? We can't fathom that Yisrael engaged in such a behavior. Therefore, we use a Lishna Ma'alya. But then we say a Nachri, a stranger, Haba'al Aviv, who engages in a relationship with his father, Chayev Alav Shtayim. He's Chayev twice. Uchid Rav Yehuda, Rav Yehuda, Nachri Haba'al Aviv, Chayev Shtayim. Person's Chayev twice. Al Ache of, if a person has a relationship with his uncle, Chayiv Shtayim, he is Chayiv 2 as well. Amar Rava. Now Rava explains, Mistavra, it makes sense. Mistavra Milson Rav Yehuda, it makes sense. That Rav Yehuda was saying was, Be Yisrael B'Shoigeg. This case was talking about a story where this Nachri was not a Nachri, like I mentioned before. It's a Yisrael, it's a Jewish person who engaged in this relationship with either his father or his uncle B'Shoigeg. Whatever, his mind was not there. He didn't understand what was going on, wasn't paying attention. Maybe he got drunk or something. But ultimately, the bottom line is B'Shoigeg, Ube Karbon. What's the discussion over here? It's the discussion of whether or not he's chayav to bring one karban or two different karbanos. Now, v'hai de ka'amar nachri. Why does it say nachri? Why does it refer to this Yisrael as a nachri? Lishna ma'al yahu. We wanted to use a cleaner lashon. Again, it's very hard for us to express some things from our mouth. These hakadaita. If you're going to say nachri mamish, that you're actually talking about a real nachri. And hold on a second, we have a much more significant problem. Dinay mai, what's the halach with a nachri who engaged in this kind of behavior? Remember, this is something which is from the seven mitzvahs b'nei Noach. Therefore, nobody is exempt from Gilui Arayos. What's the halacha with a nachri who engaged in Gilui Arayos? The halacha is, ma'neyu ketela. He is going to be punished with ketela, with execution. Now, betray katlas lay could actually give a person capital punishment twice, and therefore the whole thing would not be relevant to have a discussion about a nachri who's chayiv misa twice. Obviously, that's not going to be relevant, and therefore when we say nachri, we're talking about a Yisrael. What is the discussion over here? The discussion over here is whether he's chayiv one karban or two different karbanos. Tani Nami Hachu, we have another rice that says similar to this. Haba'al Aviv, person who is Boel, his father, Chayiv Shtayim. He's Chayiv two things, one for Mishkav Zachar, one of them for being intimate with his father. Haba'al Achei Aviv, person has intimacy with his father's brothers, Chayiv Shtayim. Again, the same thing because of his father's brothers and because of Mishkav Zachar. Ikad Amri, there are those who say, the Loka Rebbe Yehuda. Some say that this does not fit with Rebbe Yehuda. It's confusing over here because the whole thing comes from Rav Yehuda. Now, some would say that this Rav Yehuda cannot work together with Rebbe Yehuda of our Mishnah, because our Mishnah says you only chayiv once. So Ikad Amri, some say that when a person has this relationship with their father or with their uncle, and he's chayiv twice from Yehuda, that's clearly not going like Rebbe Yehuda from our Mishnah. There are those who say, Afilu Tema Rebbe Yehuda, you could even make this work together with Rebbe Yehuda. Why? How would Rebbe Yehuda be able to say that a person who has this relationship with his father would be chayiv twice, but with his mother not? He brings her from Kavachomer, from his uncles. Why? When it comes to the father's brothers, the korva, the avivu, what's the problem with this person having this relationship with his uncles? Aside from the fact that it's Mishkav Zachar. It's a bad enough problem as it is, but aside from the Mishkav Zachar problem, it is because it's his father's brother. In other words, the whole thing comes by way of the fact that this is his father's brother. In other words, it's too close. It's too close in the family. It's an uncle. Now, still, he's going to be chayiv twice. Chayiv Shtayim, Aviv lo kol shekain. I mean, the father's even closer. And therefore, you can make a kal v'chomer to say the person will be chayiv twice. Now, how could you argue on this? It seems like a very simple kavachomer. The kamiflagi beplukta dabai v'rava. What would be the machlokus whether you can make this kavachomer or not? Mar savar onchin minadin, Mar savar ein onchin minadin. Over here, you're right. Logically, it would make sense that a person would be chayiv twice for this relationship with their father. Why? Because if a person is chayiv twice with the relationship with their uncle, And the whole problem with the uncle, again, aside from it being Mishkav Zachar, is that he is related through his father. So father will be even worse. So it's a very simple, logical inference you can make from this to say that the father would be even worse and at least the same. Now the problem is, Ein Onshin Min Adin, when it comes to Onshin, to giving a punishment, we never use Kal V'chomer to be able to give an extra punishment. There's a lot of reasons for this, a lot of discussion about this. I think it's beyond the scope of today's shir, but the most simple understanding of Ein Onshin Min Adin is, even though logically everyone in this room might come to a conclusion saying that yes, it's worse for a person to engage in that kind of relationship with a father than for an uncle, at the end of the day, we only go so far with our logic. You know when you stop using logic? When it comes to punishing other people. In other words, when it comes to a Kal V'chomer, you know what? Sometimes you find a pircha. We find it all the time in Shas. You make a Kal V'chomer, you always assume this is more chomer than that, and pitom, you find something which says, you know what? That thing that you thought was more kal actually was more chomer. And the whole logical inference falls apart. So therefore, when it comes to giving someone an onesh, we don't give onshin just because of our logical inferences. And therefore, even though from a logical understanding it would make sense that a father's worse than an uncle, still ain't onshin min adin. Okay, now the Gemara goes through fitting all these psukim together, both with Rabbanan and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbanan azhara le'eshes aviv minalahu. Where do they find the azhara? Because remember, according to them, they used ervas avicha to mean actual relationship with the father. So where do they have the azhara from? Nafkalahu mi ervas eshes avicha lo segali. So they learn it out from the words ervas eshes avicha lo segali. Now hold on, Rabbi Yehuda. So what does Rabbi Yehuda do with that? That should be extra. Again, that's in the pasuk that's in Parak Yud Ches of Ervas Eishes Avicha Lo Segali Ervas Avicha He. That's the extra one according to the Chacham. Now, what does Yehuda do with that? Yehuda Hahu Mi Bayile. We need that Lazharas Eishes Aviv La'achar Misa. We need that for the Azhara to warn us about Eishes Aviv La'achar Misa after he dies. In other words, there's going to be a problem even post-death. Rabbanan, so what do they do with that? In other words, how are they going to know that after death is a problem? The whom safe to kra nafka. They learned it out from the end of the pasuk, which is, it says clearly at the end of that pasuk, ervas avicha. The repetition of the words ervas avicha is your father's erva. That's how they learn even after the father dies. Rabbi Yehuda. Now, what does Rabbi Yehuda do with the extra words? He needs it mishum eishes av atamachayvai. You mimchayev him, like we said earlier, because of eishes av, because being the father's wife. V'atamachayv mishum eishes ish. There's no problem of eishes ish. Now hold on a second, because it's a big problem. The Gemara is going to say, hold on. We learned in our Mishnah that you do pile on eishes ish on top of eishes av. Boel Eishes Av, the person is Boel, his father's wife. Chayev alav mishum Eishes Av, a person is chayev because of his father's wife. Mishum Eishes Ish, and because of Eishes Ish. And it says clearly in the Mishnah, Bein b'chayi aviv, Bein lachar misas aviv. And guess what? You're waiting for Yehuda to show up and say, no. Only chayiv alachas, just like you said earlier in the Mishnah, when it comes to a mother, it's only chayiv once, not twice. You expect Yehuda to pop up and say, when it comes to his father's wife, he's only chayiv once, and not twice because of his father's wife. And Eishes Ish, V'lo Palag Yehuda. He does not come and argue. So therefore, it can't be that he uses that and teaches the halacha that he's chayiv twice. It's chayiv only once. Rabbi, I'm sorry, the Mishnah did not report it. However, Palag B'Braisa, you can't stop learning after you learn the Mishnayos. You can learn all the Braisas because there's a Braisa Rabbi Yehuda does argue that says if a person is Boel, his father's wife, he's only chayiv once and not twice because of Eishes Ish and Eishes Av. Okay, Rabbanan Onesh to Eishes Aviv la'achar misa min aluhu. So we found the Azhara. Where do you find the Onesh for a father's wife after he dies? The Gemara says, Bishlam Rabbi Yehuda. According to Rabbi Yehuda, everything makes sense because Ma'asila big Gzera Shava. He made this Gzera Shava. El Rabbanan, because remember we mentioned earlier on today's Amud that it was mufna, it was left open. El Rabbanan minalahu. Where do they get it from? Amri lach hahu erves avicha gila. They get that from hu erves avicha gila. The mapik Rabbi Yehuda l'gzer shava mafkile leinu laonish the eishes aviv. In other words, whatever he used for gzer shava, They use that as the onish for Eishes Aviv. Which one? La'achar misa, after he passed away. Rabbanan, onish li'imo she'eno Eishes Aviv min alahu. How do you know that there's a punishment for a person who is Boel, his mother, who's not his father's wife? Where did he get that from? Amar of Shisha Breid of Idi, for all those who are sitting at the end of their chair after yesterday's Amar, the Gemara just referenced to Shisha Breid of Idi and didn't tell us who he was and where he was coming from. Got some good news for you. Here he is. He finally shows up here in the Gemara, which is Amar Kra Imcha. He, the pasuk says Imcha. He asa kasav li'imo she'ena eishes aviv ki'imo shehi eishes aviv. The pasuk says imchahi and equates that whether to a married mother, so it makes no difference whether she's married or not married. Any case is going to be a problem. Back to the Mishnah, Baal Kalaso. Person is Boel, his daughter-in-law. Now the Gemara asks, L'chayv nami mishum eishes beno. The Mishnah does not mention that there's a violation of eishes beno. Amar Rabbi pasuk hakasav b'kalaso. The pasuk opens up. In other words, there's two separate problems. There's one problem that it's the father's daughter-in-law. Just make sure to understand this correctly. There's the idea that it's the father's daughter-in-law. There's a relationship between this woman and this man because she is his daughter-in-law. In other words, daughter-in-law is not just a phrase. In law, halachically, there's something called a daughter-in-law. She becomes a daughter-in-law by virtue of the fact that she married his son, and there's now a direct relationship of daughter-in-law. This is at least what the Gemara thinks. And there's a separate relationship, which is that this woman is his father's son. So the Gemara wants to say she should be chayiv twice. Once for being his daughter-in-law, another one for being his son's wife. The Gemara says, L'chayv nami mishum eishes beno. Rabbi pasuk hakasav b'kalaso. V'sayim be'eishes beno. Lomar lach zui kalaso zu eishes beno. No, there's no difference between a daughter-in-law and your son's wife. At the end of the day, the problem is exactly the same. In other words, you would have thought, like we were saying before, that there's a direct relationship of daughter-in-law, which is, again, it's impossible to separate the two, but you would have thought that there's an issur of daughter-in-law and son's wife. No, it's actually exactly one and the same. It's just a semantical difference whether we refer to this person as your daughter-in-law or your son's wife. In any case, it's going to be forbidden, but there's only going to be one issur for that. Mishnah continues. Haba'al is zachar. A person is boel, a male. The ala behema, the person is boel, an animal. The isha mevia esa behema beskila, a woman who brings an animal upon herself. The halacha is that there is skila for all parties involved. Now the Mishnah, in a perhaps atypical fashion, the Mishnah asks a question. Im adam chote, behema machata. The person did something wrong here. Animals can't do averos. Why is the animal being punished? An animal is just an animal. Animals can't make good choices. There's no bechira for an animal. Why is the animal being punished? The Gemara says, El lafisha ba la'adam takala al yada lafikach amar kasav tisakel. This animal was the vessel by which a person did a terrible avera, and therefore the pasuk says the animal must be put to death. The Mishnah has another explanation for this as to why the animal is put to death. Why shlo tehei behema overes pashuk v'yomer hazu ish nisko ploni al yada? That's the infamous animal that this following person was put to death over. We saw a similar concept, not exactly the same thing, when it came to lo salam nivlaso. Allah 8, that when it says when a person shall be hanged, we don't leave the person there. We mentioned, I think it was last week on Shabbos, that if a person is ever going to be hanged, the hanging is literally for a second. It's after the person's already dead. They hang the body, immediately take it down. Why not? Because we don't want a person to say, oh, you know why this person's hanging? Because this person went ahead, was Megadef, was Mevarech Hashem, was over the Avodah Zarah. Such a Chil Hashem comes out about that because it kind of publicizes the story. We don't want to publicize such a tremendous Chil Hashem. I think this is a similar concept, that if a person engages in this kind of behavior with an animal, and a person is going to be put to death as a result of it. So whenever this animal walks by in the street, it says, oh, that's the infamous cow. Or you know what happened with that cow? And everyone's whispering, everyone's tapping each other on the shoulder. That's the cow that's going down the block. What a chil Hashem comes out. First of all, it's a chil Hashem that this happened. And second of all, even though the person had to be put to death, it's a bizayon. It's a tremendous bizayon to the person. The people should go around talking about that. And therefore, we're just going to put the animal to death. Why is that fair to the animal? Life's not fair. Very good. Life's not fair. As the human dignity takes precedence. Again, remember the human dignity of an Aryeh. And again, we didn't even mention this so many times. It's so rare that a case like this will ever happen. And even if a case like this happens, the probabilities of the misa, the capital punishment, actually being carried out, in other words, to qualify for the capital punishment to happen, is very difficult. We'll get to this Mirza Hashem later on. It comes up in Mesechus Makos again. It's very difficult to actually adjudicate a case which is going to result in the death penalty. So even for the rare case that the person was so brazen, they were warned right then and there, the Eidim were there with the psukim, and there's nothing else, no possible excuses that came up. The person went ahead and brazenly did it in front of Eidim, and the Eidim could not be caught up on anything. In such a case, still, the human dignity takes precedence. The human dignity of the Aryeh takes precedence. Zachar minalon. How do we know that there's a chi of skila for a person who engages in this relationship with the Zachar? The Gemara says, the Tanur Rabbanan, we learned, Ish, it says in the Pasuk, just to read the Pasuk, it says, the Ish asher yishkav es Zachar mishkeve isha. And a Ish asher yishkav es Zachar will sleep with the Zachar, mishkeve isha, in the way that a person sleeps with a woman. To'eva asu, it's an abomination what was done. Shneim mos yumasu, both of them shall be given the punishment of misa, d'meim bam, to be punished with their blood. Now, the Gemara darshans the pasuk is as follows: Ish, what says in the pasuk, Ish prat lekatan, that excludes a katan. Asher yishkav es zachar. It's an interesting thing. We went through this yesterday. Why do you have to exclude a katan? So actually, at the end of today's Gemara, we're gonna, if we get to the end of the Dalet Beis, we'll describe this a little bit more. But I mean, katan are always excluded. Why do you have to have a pasuk for this? There are those who say that an interesting idea, which is basically, since this is from the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach, so you don't find a concept of katan and zachar by b'nei Noach. So you might think the concept of a katan, a bar mitzvah boy, is only a Jewish concept. When is a boy chayiv in mitzvahs? When it comes to bar mitzvah. But that's only with regard to the chiyuvim that are relevant to a yid. But maybe when it comes to the chiyuvim that are relevant to a ben Noach, that's always going to be the case. And therefore, makes no difference between a zachar, a katan, and a gadol. So therefore, ish prat lekatan. That excludes a child. Asher yishkav es zachar, bein gadol, bein katan. So if the subject in the case is a child, it's still going to be a problem. In other words, as long as the boel is a gadol, then whether or not the subject is a katan is still going to be a problem. Mishkevei isha, when it says in the pasuk mishkevei isha, magid lecha kasav sheshnei mishkavos beisha. The pasuk teaches you that there are 2 types of mishkavos beisha. In other words, when the pasuk includes the mishkavei isha, it's essentially telling you that by an isha, it's possible for a person to be boel kedarka and shelo kedarka. By zachar, obviously the only way to be boel is only kedarka. Now it says mishkavei isha twice to tell you that the mishkavei isha, the second type shelo kedarka of an isha, is also considered to be a bia, which is a problem, and that's going to be the problem by a man. So Amar Rabbi Shmuel comes to tell, he says, Hareza bola lamev nimtza lamad. This pasuk of Mishkevei Isha came to teach me a halacha by Zachar, that a person who engages with a Zachar shlo kedarka, because that's the only way to possibly do it when it comes to a Zachar, and that's the Isser of Mishkav Zachar. It comes to teach you something about Mishkevei Isha as well. In other words, we reference Mishkevei Isha to teach us halacha about a Zachar. What do we learn, by the way, when we mention that when it comes to an Isha, a person engages with a woman who he's not allowed to engage with, whether it's kedarka or shlo kedarka, it's always going to be a problem. Most yumasu, the pasuk tells us they're going to be chayiv misa beskila. The chayiv skila ata omer beskila. More doubts this. Hold on, is it really skila? O eno ela ba'achas mekomitz amuras b'Torah. Maybe this is referring to all other mitzvahs which are relevant in the Torah. Maybe it's going to be streifa, harag, or chanek. The Gemara says no. Never kan to bam. It says here is bam. Never ba'ovi yadoni is bam. We've mentioned this drasha many times before. It says ba'ovi yadoni bam. Malalam beskila af kan beskila. Just like when it comes to ovi yadoni, the punishment is skila. So too over here it says bam, and therefore it's going to be Skila. All right, so the Gemara in the Daled on the base, top of the Yamad. Onish Shamanu. Fine, the pasuk is very clear. We have an Onish over here. Azhara minayin. Where do you find an Azhara for Mishkav Zachar? Again, as we mentioned, you can have a pasuk which has an Onish, but you have to have another pasuk which gives us the Azhara, the warning. Talmud Lomar. The pasuk says Ve'as Zachar Lusishkav Mishkav Isha. There's another pasuk which says very clearly. It doesn't come with a punishment, but it's a very clear instruction. Ves zachar lo siska mishkve isha to eva he. It is an abomination. Lamadnu azhar l'shochev, says the Gemara. Fine, we found an azhar for the person who is the shochev. Azhar l'nishgav minayin. How do you know that the subject is warned as well? In other words, the shochev, the active member of the group, that we find in Azhar because it says Ves Zachar Lo Sishkav. Now, how do you know about the Nishkav? Minayin Tamalomar Lo Yia Kadesh B'nei Yisrael. A person should not engage himself with Znus B'nei Yisrael. V'Omar, to back this up, that the word Kadesh actually means Nus. V'Gam Kadesh Hayu Be'eretz Asu Kechot Evas Hagayim Asher Hayrish. You see clearly that the word Kadosh in this context is referred to to'evos, to abominable actions, and therefore that adds in, that extra pasuk is added in. So even though, in other words, we have this pasuk over here in Malachim, which helps us to find the pasuk of Lo Yikadosh B'nei Yisrael, Lo Yikadosh B'nei Yisrael is in Devarim. So that's the Azhara for the Nishkav. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael, that's Rabbi Yishmael learns it. And it's very important to keep this in mind, because we're going to see very soon that these drushes are going to have a nafka mina, but clearly, according to Rabbi Yishmael, there's an extra pasuk of Lo Yiyeh Kadesh. That extra pasuk of Lo Yiyeh Kadesh is the additional pasuk which is the Azhara. However, Rabbi Akiva disagrees, and he says, Eino tzarach, you do not need to have the pasuk of Lo Yiyeh Kadesh, and therefore you're not darshaning it. Hareyu Omer Ves Zachar Lo Sishkav. We read the pasuk with the nekudos of sishkav mishkave isha. So again, when you use the nekudos of lo sishkav, it refers to the actionable member, the member who's acting. However, karibei lo si shachev. In other words, there's no nekudos in the Torah. So therefore, it's possible that you could actually read the same word, lo si shachev, so it has a dual definition. One definition is lo si shkav, a person should not engage in the activity. The other one is lo si shachev, should not be the subject of the activity. Therefore, you have the azhara, both for the shochev and the nishkav in the same place. Okay, so we have an azhara for the shochev, we have an azhara for the nishkav, and we have an onish for the shochev and for the nishkav. That's very clear from the previous pasuk. Now, behema minalan. How do you know a person who engages in this action with a behema schayv skila? The Torah Rabbanan first says in the pasuk ish. The pasuk tells you ish, as we said before. Prat katan comes to exclude a child. Asha yitain shechavto behema. He gives his shechiva with the behema. Bein gedola, bein katana. Whether the animal is a gedola or katana, there's definitely no such thing as a gadol or a katan when it comes to an animal. There's no size, there's no age, which is more relevant than the other one. All of them are going to be a problem. Pasuk says most yumas beskila. Pasuk does not say skila. Pasuk says most yumas, and we understand beskila. Gemara asks the same question we've asked many times before. Ata omer beskila o einer ela b'achs we call mitzvah mitzvahs hamuras b'Torah. How do you know it's skila? Maybe it's one of the other types of capital punishment. Nemar kan tarogu. The nemar lalan. Ki harog targenu. Over here it says tarogu. It says also by, I believe it's a mesis mediach. The pasuk over there is Ki harog targenu yadcha tia ba barishana lamisav yadcha adam b'achrona. I believe those psukim are, it's either I think Re'eh or Shoftim, where it says, I think it's talking about a person who was a mesis mediach, who is trying to pull people away from Kadosh Baruch Hu to Avodah Zarah. Over there it says clearly in that case, just like in that case, it says very clearly it's talking about skila. Afkam, beskila, so we have the arog targenu, those words end up being teaching us that it's beskila. Okay, fine. The Gemara says, we learned the onish, the punishment for the person who sleeps. Onish l'nishkav, the person is the subject of this behavior with an animal minalan. How do you know that? Tamalomar kol shochev and behema most. You must clear open shop pasuk in the Torah that says anybody who sleeps with an animal will be punished with misa. We don't need it to tell us the halacha for a person who is the action based person over here. Why? Because we already have a pasuk for that. It's no inyan linishkav. So therefore, if it's repeated and it's not necessary, you could just say it's talking about the person who is the subject. Lamadnu onish. Very good. You found an onish. However, as you mentioned many times on the summit, an onish is not enough. Where do you have an azhara, a warning in the psukim for a person who engages in this type of behavior with an animal? Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says, "Ubechal behema lo sitein shechavtecha l'tamaba." A person should not put himself or his shechiva in front of any animal to become tamei. Labmadnu azhar l'shochev. Okay, so very good. Remember, there's going to be always 4 cases over here. There is the shochev, and the nishkav, and the azhara, and the onish. So fine, you got me one more pasuk to give me the azhara. However, it says lo sitin shechat chalatalaba. The lamadu azhara, we found the warning, the shochev for the shochev. The nishkav to the subject minayin. Where do you have an azhara, a warning for the subject? Tamalomar lo yiyeh kadesh b'nei Yisrael. So he used the same pasuk as he used earlier. The person should not be involved in znus and these types of behaviors. So that is the warning. The Omar, and it says the gam kadesh yiyeh ba'aretz, as we said earlier, that this pasuk can be used as a warning for any type of znus. Now the Gemara says, Rabbi Shmuel. That is where Rabbi Shmuel learns it. Rabbi Shmuel learns it from Lo Yiyeh Kadesh. In other words, Rabbi Shmuel from before, who learned this by Mishkav Zachar, could learn the same exact Lo Yiyeh Kadesh when it comes to a behema. Rabbi Kiva, remember Rabbi Kiva, he learned earlier that he didn't learn from Lo Yiyeh Kadesh as the Azhara. Rather, he said the words were Ves Zachar Lo Sishkav, and Sishkav could either be pronounced Sishkav or Sishachev. So therefore, both of them are included. What does he do? Rabbi Kiva Omer, which means you could also pronounce that as lo sitein shechivasecha. Don't place any of your shechiva. So whether this person is the actionable person or the one who is the subject, in that case, in any case, is going to be azhara. Now the Gemara is going to actually find it's interesting. Generally, we don't find that when you have drashas that we get so deep into the drashas that we're going to find the nafkamina in the drasha. But here, because there is a halachic nafkamina, the Gemara is going to go through it. Habal Zachar, a person who is Baal Zachar. Now Rashi points out, whenever you see Zachor with the Vav, it refers to the place of the Zachar that a person is engaging with. So Habal Zachar in this case means a person is the one who is the shochev, the one who is, let's just call him the one who is sleeping with the other Zachar. The Havia loves Zachar. Now he actually, in the same time, also brought himself in the other way as having a Zachar with him. So that doesn't necessarily mean exactly the same time or the same helam. Because referring to a person who's bringing a chatas over here, so the exact same forgetting, the person violated a Zachar by being the shochev, and he was also violated as a Zachar as being the nishkav. Now, in such a case, Amar Bavo, if you think about this, says Rabbi, l'dvarav, l'divri Rabbi Yishmael, according to Rabbi Yishmael, chayiv shtayim, is chayiv twice. Why? Because it's a separate azhara for a zachar, for a shochev and a nishkav. So if a person's engaged both as a shochev and a nishkav, it's 2 separate averos. Now, chayiv shtayim, chadim lo sishkav, chadim lo yikadesh. The Rabbi Akiva, according to Rabbi Akiva, his azhara was not a separate pasuk. It just was the nekudos. Do you say sishkav or sishachev? It's the same pasuk, so therefore it can't be one. The Rabbi Akiva in the chayiv ala achas. Why? Because lo sishkav and lo sishachev chadahi. Habal behema, person is baal an animal, beheva behema alav, and he also has the animal in the other way. So again, Amar Bavo, the same thing which would probably be true. The Divrei Rabbi Yishmael chayiv shtayim. According to Rabbi Yishmael, because this separate drasha of Lo Yiyeh Kadesh is chayiv twice, there's 2 separate isurim of being the shochev and the nishkav. Chadim lo sitein shechavtecha, chadim lo Yiyeh Kadesh. Divrei Rabbi Akiva, according to Rabbi Akiva, in the chayiv al achas, you only chayiv once. Why? Because shechavtecha v'shechivascha. Again, it's just a matter of the pronunciation of the word. So if it's just a matter of pronunciation of the word, it's not a separate isur. So therefore, the isur of being the active one with an animal or the subject with an animal is the same isser, and therefore if a person violates both at the same time, it can only be chayiv once. Abaye disagrees with Rabbi and he says, Abaye Amar, Afilu Divri Bishmal, Nami Ene Chayev Alachas. Even according to Bishmal, you only Chayev once. Why? In other words, even though it says, Lo Yeh Kadesh, and that's the Azhara, says Abaye, the Chiksiv Lo Yeh Kadesh Begavri Ksivi. That was a mitzvah that was given to people, and therefore you can't apply that to behemoths. According to Bishmal, so if you're going to tell me that it's not true, that you can't use Lo Yeh Kadesh to warn a person about this kind of engagement with an animal, so then where does he indeed know the Azhara? In other words, you just nixed off what we said before. Where it says, Nafkale mi kol shochef in behema. It says very clearly, kol shochef in behema mos yumas. If we don't need it to teach us the Azhara for the one who is the shochef, the active member, now in the lishkav, you could just apply it to the nishkav. That's the rule when it comes to psukim. If you have a pasuk which is repetitive and you don't need it for its actual meaning of the pasuk, you can always apply it to the same inyan, but to the same concept, but a different part of that. So in this case, you don't need it for the shochet because it was already, you have an azhara and you have an onish, and therefore you can apply it to the nishkav, to the subject. Now, why did the Torah do that? Why the Torah used the lashon shochev to describe the subject? Mas shochev onesh v'hizir. Just like we saw, we have psukim which tell us that there's an onesh and an azhara for the shochev. Af nishkav onesh v'hizir. When it comes to the subject, there's an onesh, there's a punishment, and there's an azhara. The Gemara says now, hanirva lezachar. A person is nirva to a zachar. He's the subject of this zachar relationship. V'hanirva lebehema. He's also nirva in the same helam to an animal. So again, Amar of Rabbi Avo says, L'divri Rabbi Akiva, according to Rabbi Akiva, chayiv shtayim. He's going to be chayiv twice. Why? Because again, it's two separate isurim. Because according to Rabbi Akiva, it makes sense. It's two separate isurim. It's not lo yeh kadesh. It's two separate isurim. Chadim lo tishkav, v'chadim lo shechavtecha. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael, according to Yishmael, this is where it comes out to be. According to Yishmael, there's less. Eino chayev ela achas. You only chayev one. Because idi lo yeh kadesh. They're both coming from lo yeh kadesh. The Gemara says he uses lo yeh kadesh twice. The Gemara says hahu. No, Idi lo yikadeshu. Abaya Amar, Afilu Divri Yishmael, even according to Yishmael, Nami Chayiv Shtayim. You can still have Chayiv Shtayim if he's the subject of both a zachar and an animal. The Chsiv, Kol Shochev, and Behema Mos Yumas, the Meinu Inu L'Shochev, and Inu L'Ishkav. If you don't need that passage to tell you the halacha, as we just mentioned before, for a Shochev, you could borrow it for the Nishkav. As we said before, the Torah uses the nishkav and the lashon of shochev. Ma shochev onish v'hizer, af nishkav onish v'hizer. Again, the same Gemara, just like the shochev, there's a punishment, there's a warning. Aval haba ala zachar, a person who is the active member in being bo ala zachar, vehevi zachar alav, and he also brought a zachar on him. Or habal behema, person was bal behema, vehebi behema alav. So all those cases together. Now bein Rabavo, bein labaya, Rabbi Yishmael chayiv shalish. According to Yishmael, you chayiv 3 times. Rabbi Akiva chayiv shtayim. According to Rabbi Akiva, you only chayiv twice. Let's go a little further. Torah Rabbana. Zachar. It says in the pasuk Zachar with the vav. Lo asubo katan kagado. He did not make a katan like a gado. In other words, we said when it came to an animal, we equated zachar, a katan and a gado. Behema, when it came to a person who's shochev with a behema, asuba ketana kegedola. We did equate a ketana and a gedola. It makes no difference how old the animal is. Now the Gemara says, what does this mean? Mai lo asuba katan kegado. What does it mean? We didn't make a child like a gado. Amarav lo asu bias pachos mi bentesha shanim ke bentesha shanim. We did not make the bia of a child who is 9, who's less than 9, like a child who is 9. We'll explain this in a minute. Shmuel says, Lo asabiyas pachas mi ben shalosh shanim ke ben shalosh. So we didn't make the bia of a ben shalosh of less than 3 years like 3 years. Mike Mufagi, what's the argument over here? Rav Sarah called the Isa b'shochev, Isa b'nishkav, called the less b'shochev, less b'nishkav. If a person can be a boel, he could be a nishkav. Shmuel Mishkav Ishiksiv. Has to be mishkveh isha. In other words, as follows. We know the halacha is that the bia of a male child under the age of 9 is not considered a bia. We do not assume that a child under the age of 9 has the ability to be able to perform a bia. Similarly, halachically speaking, a bia of a girl, pachas mishalosh, is not considered to be a bia. So the question just is, when you have the male child who is the subject, as disturbing as this whole conversation is, the question just is, do you equate a male child to a female child? To say, well, since the male child can perform a bia above the age, cannot perform a bia until the age of 9. Therefore, the subject, if the child is the subject, then it will not be considered to be a bia until the child is 9. Or do we say, then hold on, it's mishkveh isha, it's like mishkveh isha, just like when it comes to a girl, 3 is the cutoff, and not 9. That's the machlokas. That's what the Gemara says. What's the machlokas? Rav Savar called Isa b'shochev, Isa b'nishkav. If the child's old enough to be the shochev, he's old enough to be the nishkav. If he's not old enough to be a shochev, in other words, he's less than 9, less of a nishkav. If a male's going to engage with him, an older, as a gadol is going to engage with him, then it's less of a nishkav. He's not, again, no one's condoning this behavior. The question just is whether there's a chi of misa in this case, then less of a nishkav, then it's not going to qualify as a nishkav in that age. Shmuel says mishkveh isha ksiv has to be mishkveh isha, and therefore mishkveh isha, what's the cutoff of mishkveh isha? 3 years old, and therefore you'll give the zachar the halacha of a female in this context. We'll stop here for today. Everyone has